Welcome, welcome everyone. We have a few folks that are making their way in to join us today for our gentrification discussion. So I will give those individuals a few moments to hop in, but first I'd like to just take the opportunity to introduce myself to you. If you guys are not aware, I'm Natalie Davis. I am your 2021 Chair for the Diversity and Inclusion Committee here at the Colorado Association of Realtors, and we are bringing you a fabulous discussion, in my personal opinion, on gentrification in Colorado. What it means to you, what it means to your business, what it means to the communities that you serve. We're going to dive in and take a look at that today in our time together. And because I know that we are all still fairly busy in our current real estate market, I want to take the opportunity to thank you before we get too deep into the discussion, to thank you for taking the time out of your business to educate and continue to raise the level of knowledge and expertise that you're able to bring to your clients and the communities that you serve. I personally have learned so much over the last couple of months in preparing for this topic and this discussion, and I'm hoping that you guys have the same takeaways. So it looks like our waiting room is almost empty, so as people trickle in, let me also go over a couple of housekeeping rules for everyone before we dive in. First of all, we will have the recording of this discussion that is available to you, and it will be available on our the CAR YouTube page as well. So if you have someone that is missing out, or if you have to duck out a little early, know that we will have this information available on our website and sent out in an email follow-up. We also want to make sure that we enter into this discussion with an understanding that we are going to come in from a place of curiosity, wanting to learn, and also being respectful of the discussion that's happening today. So that's not only in the information that is going to be shared by the panelists, but also in the dialogue and discussion that we have just among the attendees. With that being said, we will have Q&A, but we're going to do that at the end. So if you do have questions throughout, just again, make sure that you're posing those questions from a place that's respectful in the comment section. Also engage in the comment section with dialogue and questions. And first, I want to hear from all of you before we dive into it. You can share in the comments, drop your questions in, and the staff will make sure that they compile those questions. And at the end, we will go over all of those questions, or as many as that we can get to, and we'll pose those to all of our panelists. And finally, before I go into the last piece of housekeeping, I'm always curious to hear who's joining us today. So if you could just take this moment to engage and interact, if you could just jot in the chat box what area you're coming or joining us from today. So what part of the state are you in? As you know, today's topic is going to cover all of Colorado, so we're hoping to serve all of our members across the state. So where are you joining us from? And if you're joining us from another part of the country, welcome, and thank you for sitting in on our Colorado discussion. Let us know where you're coming from as well. Okay, last but not least, I know that I've talked about, just entering into this conversation with an open mind and coming from a place of curiosity, wanting to learn and wanting to engage and better ourselves. If for whatever reason there is inappropriate conversation, discussion, or comments that are made, you will be removed from today's session together. So without further ado, I think that covers all of our housekeeping pieces. A ton of folks from Denver, Centennial, Steamboat Springs, I see. Beautiful Wash Park neighborhood. Awesome, awesome. Thank you guys. Okay, so I'm going to start by introducing our panelists. And today, you guys, I have cheat sheets. So usually I'm able to set myself up for our time together so that I have my talking points. But if you guys are not aware, Microsoft is doing an update on most Microsoft computers. So if you are not experiencing it, know that you will here soon. So I'm having an update. So I've got a couple of cheat notes for you. But I want to dive in and introduce our panelists that are joining us today. First, I'm so excited to introduce Gregory Howell. Gregory is a storyteller, curator, and creative economy consultant. Gregory made his way to Pueblo via Tokyo. And shortly after arriving in Pueblo, Gregory immediately realized the powerful and yet untold story of the new creative economy in one of America's greatest industrial landscapes, which was once dominated by the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company and the Knuckles Packing Company, if you guys did not know that. Gregory is currently a commissioner on the Historic Preservation Commission for the city of Pueblo, where he's an advocate for adaptive use of historic properties, economic redevelopment, and tourism. So Gregory, thank you for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Next up, we have Annalise Hawk. Annalise is a city planner with nearly 10 years of experience working with a variety of communities to develop thoughtful, community-informed, long-range plans and effective land use policies. That aligns well with our advocacy initiatives. Currently, as a principal city planner for the city and the county of Denver, their work focuses on the implementation of citywide policies aimed at increasing affordable housing and reducing involuntary displacement. In all their work, Annalise appreciates fostering unique partnerships with the community, advocates the development of industry to find unique solutions that create a more equitable, sustainable, and inclusive Denver. So Annalise, with that, I welcome you.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And last but not least, we have Jonathan Capelli. Jonathan is an experienced urban planning, real estate, and community development professional focused on finding ways to bring equitable and sustainable development to communities across Colorado. Prior to founding the Capelli Consulting, Jonathan worked at the Urban Land Conservancy, helping lead real estate acquisition redevelopment projects, developing community capacity and engagement in the Westwood neighborhood of Denver, and coordinating various national and regional housing policy initiatives. Jonathan serves on the board of Denver's retail incubator DRI Goods, All in Denver, Mile High Connects, and the Urban Land Institute Affordable Housing Committee. So Jonathan, with that, welcome to you.
Thank you, Nana.
All righty. So I would like to, before we jump too far into our discussion on gentrification, if we could, I'd like to start just by defining gentrification. So what we've done here, we've actually shared the definition of gentrification from dictionary.com. And what I found that has been interesting, just from my perspective, and I think even in the discussion that we've had with our panelists today, is that gentrification is seen in various forms and various lights. We have individuals that see gentrification as a positive, others that see it as a negative. And the discussion that panelists and I have had is that gentrification is, right? This is something that we're facing, it currently is. But a little piece of insight into some of the conversations that I had, I was actually speaking with a realtor member last week, talking about this discussion, and we were talking about gentrification and what it meant to them. And actually that person interpreted gentrification as something that only applied to the older population within communities. And with that, it's like the light bulbs just continue to go off in my head, realizing that as an industry, realtors actually view gentrification differently. And it's not just within our industry. I think across the board, there are different interpretations on gentrification. So as we are looking at gentrification, and it's often used as a blanket statement, when we're looking at communities that are transforming, what I want to take a look at is actually our panelist description and insight on what gentrification means to them or how they see gentrification in their line of work. So Gregory, I'm going to turn it over to you. If you could just share with us kind of your insight on the term gentrification, or even the concept of gentrification and how it applies to your business and how we can look at it differently.
Yeah, and I think the way that I really look at gentrification, and in terms of where I am in Pueblo, Colorado, is really looking at this term of adaptive reuse. Because adaptive reuse is really this amazing, oftentimes complex process of repurposing buildings for a viable new uses and modern functions, oftentimes very different than their original purpose when they were first done. So it really is looking at reuse and allowing buildings to continue to be used and to help it remain kind of a viable community asset. It's also really important for the community because it maintains cultural heritage. So in communities with historic architecture, adaptive reuse is a form of historic preservation. It restores culturally significant sites that would otherwise be left to decay or demolished to make room for new buildings or parking lots. And there is a whole other layer to this, which we'll get into in more detail, which adaptive reuse doesn't have to always be about a historic building, because most historic buildings, which once they reach 50 years of age, they can then qualify for designation. So, but with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, they have a whole platform, which is called reurbanism. And reurbanism positions preservation in the larger context of human needs. And as we go through this presentation, I'll get into a little bit more detail, but I'll pass it over to our others who are going to share their perspective too.
Fabulous, Greg. I appreciate that. So looking at that from the concept of preservation, and even the term adaptive reuse, and I'm going to ask our attendees as well, adaptive reuse, if that's a term that you're using with your clients, our realtor members that are on, is that a term that you're discussing with your clients? Is that a concept that you've once embraced? I'd love to hear from you. Drop that in the chat box. But thank you, Gregory, for sharing that. I appreciate it. Annalise, I'm going to turn it over to you because, again, when we talk about the term gentrification, especially with the city of Denver and the county of Denver, you guys look at it differently and probably are not really utilizing the term as frequently as we use it here in the real estate industry. So kind of tell us how you guys look at and embrace the concept of gentrification or address the concept of gentrification in your line.
Thank you, Natalie. And you're right. I would say gentrification is a term we use less and less in our work, either internally or in conversations with the community and or industry. Really, I think we sort of break it apart into two aspects and acknowledge that gentrification isn't inherently bad, but rather the involuntary displacement that can occur to communities that have long time been there, oftentimes communities of color, lower income communities who are now involuntarily displaced. And so how Denver really perceives and kind of looks at this is thinking about how can we continue to invest with needed infrastructure, resources, transit, parks, all sorts of things, bringing in high quality jobs into neighborhoods and allow for that investment to occur while having stabilizing efforts and resources in place. And that really kind of takes a two-pronged approach in how we think about it. And I'll speak a little bit to more later in the session, but it's certainly about how do we stabilize existing residents from a housing perspective, as well as build wealth building opportunities, because we need to look at this from both sides. So when we're thinking about gentrification, it's really about how do we invest in communities while ensuring that existing residents, can really stay to benefit from those investments that they've been missing out on for such a long time.
Wow, wonderful, Annalise. I appreciate that, and again, it's the involuntary displacement, right? And ways to avoid that. And so, looking at gentrification. And not necessarily looking at it from the concept of gentrification, but more, is there involuntary displacement that's occurring and what can we do? And music to our ears, because I think realtors play such a huge role in the wealth creation that is connected to real estate and the opportunity for wealth creation. And oftentimes it's seen that there are segments of our population that are missing out on that, but that's something that's at the forefront as you guys have these conversations and looking at continuing to develop our communities.
Absolutely.
Beautiful. Thank you, Annalise. I appreciate it. Jonathan, I'd love to hear from you as well, because your experience and your involvement in Colorado, the fact that you have kind of a finger on the pulse in so many areas across the state, I'd love to hear from you on the same question. When you're thinking about gentrification, or maybe not even utilizing that term specifically, what does that mean to you and your line of business, and how do you approach that?
Thanks, Natalie. First off, a quick apology. I'm realizing that despite Holly's best efforts and yours as well, I never actually sent a bio. So just really quick. So yes, I'm the principal of Capelli Consulting. We do work out in rural Colorado, out on the western side of the state, with towns like Leadville and currently San Luis, Craig, other areas out west, helping with strategic plans to help them address their affordable housing needs. I also am the director of the Neighborhood Development Collaborative, which is a coalition of 18 nonprofit housing organizations, mostly on in Metro Denver, that are doing everything from addressing homelessness to providing home ownership. So really sorry that I just left you guys to wing at my bio and didn't answer that email.
Hey, you're good. We still know who you are, so thank you for sharing.
Okay. Yeah, to answer your question, the word gentrification is an interesting one. You know, it's if you break it down, it's the gentry, right? The gentrification of a neighborhood. Gentry, you know, higher class or higher income people moving in. There was a really funny Onion article years ago that was focused on somewhere in New York, and it was having the gentry, richer people, complaining about aristocratification, or I'm not saying that quite correctly, but the aristocracy moving in and displacing the gentry. And it had fairly rich families talking about lords with their stables coming in and just, you know, completely changing the neighborhood by building their castles. And it was obviously a joke. But so the point is that that term, gentrification, is really simply describing just the change over time of a community, and it can happen naturally. But as Annalise spoke about, what we really are most concerned about is this involuntary displacement. And that's because even though socioeconomic change in a neighborhood might be natural, the concentration of poverty and often race in some of the neighborhoods that are gentrifying is not natural. That is built off of a whole slew of historical policies that stretch over most of our country's history that resulted in that concentration. I know in the past you've all spoken about redlining and a number of other policies, but you know, if you go all the way back to the sort of the Land Act that happened sort of post Civil War, there was a whole initiative to essentially grant large tracts of land to anyone moving west. You could go and you could claim a certain number of acres, right? And most of that benefited white families. So it turns out about 20% of all white households today actually can trace their lineage straight back to folks who initially became homeowners and landowners through that policy. Then you have things like redlining, which kept people, Black and brown people, from buying in certain neighborhoods and kept them and limited their ability to become homeowners within the neighborhoods that were redlined. For myself, for my I was talking to my mom a while ago because I was trying to figure out how we became homeowners, because my family's from Northern Philadelphia, and I know we had a house there for a long time. And it turns out my great grandmother couldn't get a loan, but she was a maid for a richer family down there. And because she couldn't get one, that family actually provided like underwrote and then also provided her a loan to, not underwrote, but co-signed for a loan that she was able to get, and then lent her the rest to have her become a homeowner. And so the history of my family in Northern Philadelphia, all the way through to like everything that our family is and has been able to do, me being in Colorado, not still being in North Philadelphia, all kind of comes from that access to homeownership. So at any rate, there's a whole lot of reasons why the concentration of poverty and race in the neighborhoods that are gentrifying are what they are, and why the people that are in those neighborhoods can't afford to stay there anymore because of rising prices. Just really quick, if you look at Colorado in particular, Denver probably has the highest, or is which redlining is most applicable to Denver, because there was a bunch of neighborhoods, and I think you guys have spoken about this before, so I won't go too much into that. But that is why it looks like the way it does right now. And as those neighborhoods that were redlined are gentrifying, Denver's population of Black and brown people have actually declined over the last few years, or the last decade. And but outside of urban Colorado, there's similar patterns, although it's slightly different, happening in rural Colorado. Although some of those neighborhoods weren't redlined per se, we have a pretty interesting history of racism across the state. everyone knows that, Mayor Stapleton, so this is still Denver, was the mayor of Denver from the 30s until the late 40s, a member of the KKK. But in the 20s, there was about 35,000 people in the KKK across the state. So that sort of influence spread out into Western towns as well. I know you discussed Sundown Communities before. So that was something that happened out west. And there were some, it's not like everyone who's Black and brown moved to Colorado, moved to Denver just because they wanted to. They often were kept out of those other communities. Actually, and after the KKK's influence, I remember when we moved out west in the 90s to Colorado, we moved to Rifle, which is actually where I grew up. And my mom had a really interesting interaction with someone who was, she was trying to buy a car, and he thought that the seller thought that she was white, and started bragging about how there were so few Black people out in Garfield County and how much we'd enjoy coming here instead of the Front Range. So anyway, the point is that there's a lot of influences that really concentrated race and poverty in certain neighborhoods, and the involuntary displacement of those communities is the main thing that we try to focus on. I know we're going to talk about some solutions and how real estate agents can maybe play a role in that, but that's kind of a general sort of background for how we think about involuntary displacement. And I went over time. I'm sorry, Natalie.
No, you're good. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you, Jonathan. So the key piece, I think, in your discussion, Jonathan, and how you look at it in the conversations that we've had, it's really at looking at like the cyclical changes that we're seeing within the community that have created the concept of gentrification, or even the utilization of the term gentrification as we're talking about specific communities here in Colorado. And you're correct. During our fair housing workshop a few weeks ago, we had the opportunity to get a little bit of insight when we were looking at the history of real estate and fair housing in the state of Colorado. So coming back to that kind of that cyclical change that kind of creates the it creates the cycle, right? And and as you mentioned, it's not that it is it's good, bad, or indifferent. It is, right? It's just where we are.
And I forgot to answer another part of the question you asked me too, which was just how it shows up in rural communities, the displacement part, not how we got here necessarily. And many of you I know don't work in on the Front Range, and so gentrification will look different in a community like Leadville or Rifle. Gentrification might not be quite the correct term, but you're still dealing with the displacement of working class and lower income people from those communities for sure. And a lot of that, has to do with, it's actually a little bit more similar to that onion joke in New York, but it's a lot of people who are coming and buying second homes, right? So for instance, if you look at the Lake County where Leadville is, about a third of the homes there are now second homes. And so having that influx of folks to some of these communities, ones that aren't necessarily in the resort shed, like a typical community like the Roaring Fork Valley, where there's, Aspen at the top, and then there's a whole economic sort of cascade down from it. Communities outside of some of those resort sheds, as you guys are all seeing, I'm sure, are still having skyrocketing prices. So much so that most towns out west have declared. Summit County declared a state of emergency recently because their workforce, there's not enough housing for their workforce, and the mayor of Frisco said that he was afraid that it would become Frisco would become a functional ghost town where people came to vacation there, but there was no one to serve them. I'm not sure if that's his exact phrase, because he probably wouldn't have said it quite that way, but that's essentially what it's looking like. So there's another, it's showing up a little bit differently. It's not as if there was redlining in like some of these communities, but there are unnecessary, or there are new pressures that you're seeing that are really rapidly changing the face of those communities. And so right now, over the last 2 years in particular, there's been a lot of sort of calls for those communities to try to figure out how to retain their workforce, how young families can afford to stay there. And anyway, just want to acknowledge that it's different out west, and it's happening, and I'm sure you all are seeing in your communities. I'll stop there. Sorry, Natalie.
Perfect. Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate it. Wonderful. Well, it's a great segue because the next question that I have for you guys actually is in terms of looking at communities, right? So when we're seeing from the standpoint of revitalization, right? When we're looking at revitalization of neighborhoods, when we're looking at that in a way that it's not displacing, or we're not having as much or limiting the involuntary displacement of the current residents, what are some of the things that you're seeing happening in with communities? And Annalise, I'll start with you. If you could kick us off on that question. And I guess, Annalise, from your perspective, it will be specifically to Denver area, or even if you have insight on other parts of the state, we'd love to hear that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll speak to Denver since that's my stomping ground, and hopefully some folks have some familiarity with it. But I think there's sort of two ways that we're looking at sort of understanding how can revitalization occur and reinvestment into communities without that involuntary displacement piece, right? The good parts of gentrification that people speak to without the consequences of it, which, you know, is really understand the drivers of gentrification. How do we understand, how do we try to create a crystal ball? And I'm getting a notice that my internet's unstable, so fingers crossed.
So we can still hear you. You're good. Yep, there was a small glitch. You're great.
Perfect. But we're really kind of thinking about it in the sense that the market moves much faster than government, right? We all know this. Government's slow. We take time to react. And so the only way that we're really going to be proactive is getting ahead of market changes and using kind of predictive models, if you will. And so we've been working kind of closely with some of the research out of San Francisco. Miriam Zook and Karen Chappell have been doing a ton of research to really help understand what are the drivers of gentrification. If there is a formula for it, what is it? How do we see it coming, and how do we respond, you know, previously? And many of you might say, I'm going to share the indicators, and you might go, oh, that's where I'm going to buy my next investment property. And I'm sharing that in the acknowledgement that these are the opportunity zones that we see, but we need to be thoughtful in deploying our resources. So we certainly look at when there is significant changes in property value, just changing and watching those trends and jump and perk. What are the neighborhood investments? Do we see a lot of permits being pulled for kitchen remodels, home additions, pop tops? What is the tenure and demographics of the neighborhood? We know that neighborhoods that are historically Black and brown have a higher likelihood of gentrification. Also neighborhoods with higher rates of renters, because the ability for a landlord to terminate a lease or evict you is much easier than if you own a home. So neighborhoods with higher proportion of renters, especially those low income renters, as well as proximity to some sort of downtown area. We know that if we look at kind of the neighborhoods that have gentrified in Denver, 5 Points, I think, is an excellent example where we as the city didn't see that coming. And what we saw was 5 Points was a redlined community that was multi-unit zoning, that was historically a Black community, and now is very wealthy and much more white than it's been over, you know, the past 20 years, even on a shorter piece. Also looking at where that educational attainment is. So folks that don't have college education are also more likely to be displaced from an indicator's perspective, because their wealth building opportunities are less than that with someone of a higher education. And then also historic housing stock, right? Curtis Park, and I'm going to keep picking on 5 Points because I think folks are familiar with it, but there's really desirable housing stock. And so for folks that have money and resources to invest in that, to improve it, rather than some of the housing stock that maybe was built, you know, post-war 1960s tract built, that's less desirable. So when we kind of look at what are the areas that are susceptible, and then what are the major investments that either the city or the market's putting in, those are kind of our target neighborhoods. And we have a division in our city that's called Neighborhood Equity and Stabilization, or NEST for short, and they have 10 target neighborhoods. And these are areas like East Colfax or Globeville, Elyria, Swansea, Westwood. Many of these are communities of color, lower income, predominantly renters. And this is where we're trying to be proactive in deploying strategies. And so those strategies kind of look a little bit multi-pronged, and some of them are infrastructure building of how can we prioritize and build more affordable housing. and then pair that with a preference policy. And what a preference policy does is it says that, hey, if you've lived in this neighborhood or in the surrounding area, you get a higher priority in that lottery to access that unit, because we want to ensure that the new benefits and the new investments are really benefiting those folks that live in the community. So that cultural aspect is also there. That's something that we didn't really touch on at the beginning, but there's sort of gentrification because people are priced out, but there's also cultural gentrification where the businesses, the culture, the housing types that were resident to your culture are now lost due to reinvestment and redevelopment. And so that's another important piece. And that's where I think preference policy is something that the city's exploring, and I think is a really powerful tool from an anti-displacement perspective. Other tools that the city's also looking to leverage are just other stabilizing things like foreclosure prevention, temporary utility and rental assistance. Those are sort of emergency pieces. Where we're looking at how do we build long-term wealth and stability is where financial coaching and empowerment, microloans also for small businesses, because there's also, it's easy with this group, and I think we'll focus our conversation on displacement of existing residents, but we also need to acknowledge that many of those residents might own a small business in that neighborhood, and they don't have the capital resources to invest. We even found that a lot of the businesses along the East Colfax corridor didn't have a website. And when COVID hit, that was really the only way to access information about those businesses. And so there's resources that we deployed to bring on a contractor to help folks build websites for their businesses and kind of come into the modern era of how businesses need to thrive and survive. The other thing that we haven't been doing as much, and it actually is happening more so in kind of well-resourced neighborhoods, but I think is a tool for communities to explore, especially those that are seeing high rates of kind of scrapes and rebuilds. So what we see in many areas, especially in say West Denver, is that those kind of starter homes that might be 1,200 square feet, ranch style, 2 to 3 bedrooms, no master suite, none of the fancy things, but a fantastic starter home that allows people to get into the housing market and start building that wealth and equity. We're seeing more and more of those getting scraped and rebuilt by McMansions that are, have a starting price well over $1 million. And so this is where right-sizing zoning regulations, whether it's through baseline zoning tools or applying appropriate conservation or design overlays to try to disincentivize kind of the maximization of zoning, is something that we need to be really thoughtful of in Denver. That being said, we also don't want to overly pressure the housing market and create supply constraints. So using that tool in a thoughtful way is really important. But if we look back at what the typical American house size was in the 1960s across the states, it was just, around 1,000 square feet. Now the typical house size, across the states is well over 2,000, if not even into the 3,000s, kind of depending on if we're looking at total averages or just a single unit. Sort of the American dream, despite our family sizes actually staying small, if not getting smaller, our consumption of space and therefore cost of housing is contributing. So jumping to just, a solution from a realtor's perspective, and especially to our builders, is sort of questioning and pushing back on this notion that a couple needs a single family home with 4 bedrooms and a master suite and, a guest room and office and all of these things, and really ensuring that too, that families who actually have kids in those bedrooms are poised in a position to actually access those larger units where necessary. Because what we actually see is a lot of overcrowding in neighborhoods such as Westwood that are in those smaller post-war buildings where you have multi-generational families occurring. And so even though maybe our housing market and housing needs, if you just simply looked at it, aligns, people's ability to access the housing type that suits their household size, their affordability, is where it all kind of breaks down. And that's where we have to take kind of government interventions to create either incentives or regulations to promote those outcomes, and also ultimately find partnerships is where kind of the biggest opportunity is, especially with many of our affordable housing developers across the state and in the region. So there's a lot more that I could probably talk to in terms of what we're trying to do. I will say, just like predicting gentrification is not a science, addressing anti-displacement is not a science, and there's not a silver bullet to meeting those needs. And so that's where really taking as much of a multi-pronged approach, and also taking metrics and reporting to understand where those successes are, and hearing people's stories and looking at their long-term ability to build wealth and be stabilized in neighborhoods is really what we're trying to focus a lot of our resources on.
Perfect, Annalise. I appreciate that. And if you don't mind, I'd love if you would share those indicators with Holly. I think that would be great for us to share with everyone that's able to join us today. Those are key indicators that you're looking at, but like you said, there's no true science to it just yet. And you guys are walking a fine line, right? If you talk about, restricting our housing inventory, there's an issue that we run into there. And if you talk about the involuntary displacement, we're looking at, other concerns, and then you unfold overregulation, and then we're having a completely different conversation. So thank you for the work that you're doing, and thank you specifically for outlining those key examples that we are actually that we have lived through over the last couple of years here in Denver, and what that experience has been like. Something that you mentioned specifically with the NEST program, and that popped up for me, is for those that are listening in, if you're not aware, for the local municipalities, a lot of our officials are friends with officials in other communities. So if something like the NEST program is something, and you're not in the Denver area, and that would be of interest to your community, reach out, right? Let's not reinvent the wheel. These are the types of tools and resources and programs that are already in place that can help in continuing to move your initiatives forward in your specific community. So thank you, Annalise. I appreciate you sharing. So looking at, yeah, fabulous. Thank you. So I'd like to continue on with that, with the same discussion when we're looking at gentrification and the within communities, and how that kind of changes the makeup within communities, but from a different perspective. Gregory, you alluded to, and I'd love for you to take this opportunity to dive into this for us, kind of gentrification from the preservation standpoint, and what you are seeing in Pueblo, and what you yourself are spearheading and having the opportunity to work with in the Pueblo community.
Sure, more than happy to. And if I could pull up the slides, I brought some slides because I think the images will give you a really good, but to give you some context, and again, I said earlier, that adaptive reuse isn't always about historic properties, but especially with historic preservation, when you talk about reurbanism and how it positions preservation in the larger context of human needs, we know that preservation is an element in livable, vibrant, equitable, and creative communities. Preservation provides character and identity, contributes to sustainability and walkability, fosters a sound economy, it spurs creativity, and gives people the psychological and sociological sense of stability they need in their ever-changing world, especially as a result of the pandemic. Yet while the preservation of our older and historic places is critically important to a community, it is only really one part of what we need to do. So I'm going to show you some examples of really mixed use projects that we're working now with adaptive reuse. This picture here is of the historic Knuckles Packing Company, which was built, designed in 1915 by a very famous Norwegian, Hans Peter Henschen, and it took 1 year to build from 1916 to 1917. And the Knuckles family, they spent $300,000, took a year to build, and at the time, it was the world's largest, the most efficient, the most productive slaughter, meatpacking, and cold storage facility. It's 250,000 square feet, and the architect went on to develop 300 of these plants all around the world. So this building, believe it or not, no load-bearing walls in the main plant. So when we talk about just flexibility and adaptive reuse, the building was really thoughtfully and mindfully created. But the family, the Knuckles family that actually built this, was extraordinary in terms of how they led the way, in terms of innovation, the rational factory concept. The architect and Henry Ford, they worked together to talk about people, processes, and automation. But this is a mixed use project, and there is housing. And the 3 projects I'm going to show you now, all of them are historic buildings where there is a mixed use. The building to the far left is the Ice House. That will be lofts. live work lofts. And in the back, we have micro apartments, which are between 150 and 400 square feet. And the whole building is being built on the arc of ideation. So it truly is a vertical urban village. The next slide. This is Holmes Hardware. And this building is really interesting because it was built in 1915, and the builder was Alva B. Adams, who was, believe it or not, the governor of Colorado 3 separate times. But this building has been abandoned for many, many years, and now we're really excited. A group has put together what's called Fuel and Iron, again, borrowing from our historic and our cultural and sociological kind of history. The lower floor is going to be 5 restaurant incubators. So we're developing restaurant, of course, are some of the hardest industries, but this is a place for startups, restaurant startups, 5 of them. And there will be 1 anchor, Solar Roast, and it will be a European style food hall. And on the 2nd and 3rd floors, we have affordable housing, and it's a partnership with the Housing Authority. And let's show the next slide. This is Keating Junior High School, and this actually just went on to the National Register of Historic Places, just as Holmes Hardware. And as a commissioner for the Historic Preservation Commission, I sat in on the readings, and I didn't know that junior high school was a thing. But this was built in 1927, and it was one of the models for the United States. And this entire campus, the lower floors will be all retail and commercial, and the 2nd floor will all be housing. So again, it's this whole notion of how to revitalize, these historic buildings, and to, at the same time, honor the neighborhood, honor the historic context, honor the cultural context and the sociological context. And I'm a huge follower, and I work with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And there are 10 really powerful principles. And without going into a lot of detail, and I know we're limited in time, I'm going to go through them really quickly, but then in our last point, I will share with you some of the best practices and what we're doing with our building. But number 1 is cities are only successful when they work for everyone. People are the center of our work. Number 2, older places provide the distinctiveness and character that engender success. 3, older neighborhoods are economic engines. Research shows that neighborhoods with a mix of older and newer buildings perform better along a number of social, economic, cultural, and environmental metrics than areas with only new buildings. 4, new ideas and the new economy thrive in older buildings. All over America, the most innovative companies of the 21st century are choosing to make their homes in older buildings. 5, preservation is adaptive reuse. Adaptive reuse is preservation. Number 6, preservation is about managing change. Healthy, dynamic neighborhoods are always in the process of change. Historic preservation is about managing change, unleashing the enormous potential of older buildings to improve health, affordability, prosperity, and well-being. Number 7, cities are for people, not vehicles. And I love that. It's so true. Reclaiming city streets and making them more amenable to pedestrian and mass transit use can help neighborhoods reacquire activity and thrive once more. My favorite is number 8. The greenest building is the one that's already built. It takes energy to construct a new building. It saves energy to preserve an old one. Number 9, there are many ways to achieve density. Areas with a mix of older and newer fabric tend to be denser than new-only neighborhoods, and they achieve that density at a human scale. And lastly, number 10, every community has stories and places that matter. The places we're saving are those where communities choose to come together and that represent the local stories they treasure and wish to see preserved. So later, I'll give you some examples of what we're doing with some of our best practices in regards to these reurbanism principles.
Beautiful. Gregory, that was fabulous. Thank you so much for sharing. And I think you're absolutely spot on. The visuals help to drive home not only the idea, it's the actual principle and application of preservation that I know just in the conversations that you and I have had is at the forefront of importance for you and for the community. So thank you so much for sharing that. I will let you know in the chat, there are a couple of folks that want to connect with you. For everyone that registered for our workshop today, we will have a follow-up email with additional resources. Holly has already dropped the 10 principles in the chat box for you to access, but we'll include Gregory's information, contact information, Gregory, if that's okay with you.
Of course, no problem at all.
We'll actually include all of the panelists' contact information. So thank you, thank you. So looking at from Annalise's conversation on opportunity zones and looking at within our community to the revitalization and preservation of communities, I think there are so many ways that you can look at the future growth, the cyclical cycles within those communities, within our communities, the communities that we serve. So I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the advocacy side, because advocacy for the Diversity and Inclusion Committee has been at the forefront this year. It's one of our focus areas. It's also a focus area for the association. So when we're looking at advocacy initiatives for these communities, as we're moving through these cyclical transitions, kind of walk us through, Gregory, you're up. I will just start with you. Kind of what are some of those, before we jump into advocacy, let's talk about the best practices that you mentioned.
Yeah,
let's just
sure.
dive into that. Yeah.
And I have some pictures because it really helps again. And, you know, and this is not unique to Pueblo. I find that this is actually something that really addresses the local fabric. So I'm the creative consultant for Water Tower Place. So that's 250,000 square feet. It's the largest adaptive reuse project in the state and one of the largest in the country. And because it has been sitting there for generations, about 40 years abandoned, you know, people, Pueblo is like 1 degree of separation. Everyone has a story to share. So when we realized that we were going to be bringing this, you know, former meatpacking plant back to the community because it is located right in downtown, right adjacent to the Riverwalk, we realized that we really didn't want to be landlords per se, but that we wanted to create a community center. I, in a previous life, did work on 2 other meatpacking plants in Berlin and Shanghai, but I didn't come to Pueblo to do any of that. I came to open up a network of healthcare clinics, but once I was on the ground, I immediately recognized the importance of the building. So what we decided to do was to do tours of the building. And we had almost 6,000 people come through in 18 months. And about 30% of those individuals came from the Denver and Colorado Springs area. About 25% came from the New Mexico area. So we realized that the story resonated not just with, you know, the local community, but these storyboards, when you do take a tour, and I highly encourage anyone, if they're interested in a tour, I do about 10 a week, and we hope to do the public ones again this fall. But these storyboards are about 4 feet wide and about 7 feet in length, so they're massive. But they really dig into the untold story. We do the tours, these are just examples, where we welcome the community to come in. And the best part of the touring is, we learned very early on that management will always deny what happened in the former meatpacking plant, but the workers will tell us everything. So when I do the tours, I love it when we get people into the building itself, because over the first 18 months, we actually watched how people responded to the building and how the building responded to people. So what these individuals are looking at are the master plans, the floor plans, which have evolved over time. We did at the outset realize what things might work better in certain places, but until you listen, and I grew up in Japan and lived there for about 10 years, the one gift that I can say about Japan is listening. We tend to, and I love to talk, I'm a storyteller, but listening is so critically important. And when you listen to the local community, it really does resonate and it's impactful. Next slide. Just to give you an idea, this is just the mayor. We've had the governors, senators, you know, we brought in everyone from the local community all the way up to the federal government, but we also personalize it. Every tour that comes in, it's personalized for that particular group. Next slide. There we go. So this is where really it became very impactful. So after 2 or 3 years of listening to the community, we decided that we really needed to focus on what are some of our key areas? What is our focus going to be in terms of Water Tower Place, for example, being a destination? And if it's a destination for ideas, these are just 3 of the 5. We have a storytelling makerspace, small batch manufacturing, and food entrepreneurship. After talking with the community, we realized, let's create a destination where ideas are welcome, where we share resources and we make those investments so that you can come, because there's nothing worse, whether you're 5 or 95, to be told that your idea is not good or it's not right. I mean, good ideas come from all different places, but it really has served as kind of a destination. And then our goal is that when people leave the building, they go back to their homes, they go back to their churches, they go back to their schools, they go back to their sports teams, and they share what they've learned. And so it really has been a very, very powerful process for us. And lastly, and this is really important when we start talking about marginalized communities. One thing that the city of Pueblo has done is they have created, next slide, if you can pull it up. I just have 3 more. There we go. This is just 3. I was really impressed. I've worked for local governments, national governments all over the world. And the one thing that is oftentimes missing is a deep dive into a neighborhood. And so the city of Pueblo over the last 20 years has actually put together what I consider, and I make them all available on my website. They're available on the city, they're available online. These are like 200-page reports that dig into the history, the culture, the socioeconomics, everything about that particular neighborhood. And these historical context reports are used then by city planning to actually be thoughtful and mindful about how we want to do, new development, how we want to do adaptive reuse, how we want to, everything from transportation, it covers it all. But the one that really hit me very, very, just the titles are amazing. Forged Together in the Bessemer neighborhood. That's the neighborhood around the steel mill. Potitsa, Pints, and Prayers in Old Bojantown. Pueblo has the largest Slovenian population outside of Slovenia. So this neighborhood, Eiler Heights, is literally a walk back in time. And then the east side, a place set apart, the history and architecture of Pueblo's east side neighborhood. This was one of the oldest neighborhoods after the San Luis Valley that really had this interesting mix of, European and also local settlers. But what was amazing about the East Side report is they started digging into the individual homes, and they realized that about 45 of those qualified for the National Register of Historic Places. And if you don't know what you don't know, it's really hard to be thoughtful and mindful about programming. So what I love is all of these reports, and we're just now, in fact, tomorrow we'll be signing. We're doing a huge report on the Hispanic culture in Pueblo because our population is comprised of about 50%. And so they're going to do a whole Hispanic cultural context report for the city. So again, in terms of best practices, it's really about listening. It's really about going and hitting the streets and talking to people or inviting them in. And really, welcoming them, because once these stories are gone, they're gone. And if we don't honor them, it really is problematic. So for me, I'm just so pleased that of those 43 that were selected by the study, 16 now are officially, the reports are done, site surveys by Historic Colorado. So, it's pretty impressive how these context reports just went from research all the way to nomination. And now they can take advantage of tax credits, historic tax credits, all of those different things. So I just think in terms of where we are in revitalization and adaptive reuse and really embracing all of these tools, when it's rooted in an authentic and genuine story, it has the capacity to be amplified far and wide.
Wow. Gregory, that's awesome. Thank you. Thank you. And just listening to the passion as you share the initiatives that you guys have worked on and are currently working on, it's not just simply checking the box, right? It's not just, we need to make sure we listen to the stories, document it, file it file it somewhere and let's move on. You're incorporating this into what the future of the community looks like, which I think is tremendous. I will tell you, just give you a little insight into the realtor community. One thing that we don't do is sit on the sidelines. And I know that we have a ton of folks that are joining us today that are already probably involved in their historic society within their local communities, or they're volunteering or serving in some type of elected capacity. So if you are looking for ideas, if you're looking for idea exchange, we have so many friends around the state that you can lean on, programs and initiatives that have already taken place that you could borrow from, improvise, make it your own. So Gregory, thank you for giving us so much insight on that, and tools and best practices for us moving forward as we look at.
And I'll add one thing to just what you just said, specifically for realtors. We are now in the process, when you actually purchase a home, when you go through the escrow process, we're actually in Pueblo going to start to include, because it's not mandatory. Some people don't even know they're buying a historic property. So we're going to actually make that a new process. So we're in the early stages. So we may be calling on you for assistance. So, but we need to have that. So when someone buys a home, they really know what they're buying and it comes with the story.
Yes, that just gave me chills. Thank you. I think that's fabulous. Please do call us. We are happy to assist in any way possible. Fabulous. Great. Jonathan, I want to turn to you. You have a couple of initiatives that you are working on specifically in the San Luis Valley. But before we dive into that, and maybe you can tie it all in together, you made an interesting statement when we had a chance to connect about the number of communities that are actually looking for grant dollars and dollars to support revitalization or gentrification or involuntary displacement, or maybe a combination of all. Can you kind of walk us through what you're seeing across the state as far in terms of those requests for dollars right now, especially coming out of the pandemic?
Sure. I wanted to just say something quickly about the best practices. And there was a question in the chat about how realtors can or realtors. Sorry, I said that wrong.
Thank you. Yes.
Real estate agents can work on these issues. So quickly I'll do that, and then I'll talk about some of those communities, if that's okay.
That's perfect. Yeah, go right ahead.
So I was actually speaking with my colleague Mary Coddington about this because it was just an interesting question. It's interesting to be able to speak with all of you today, and there's always a little bit of a tension where it's, okay, here's best practices and here's best policies, but what can you all do? And I think Gregory spoke well to that, but there's a couple other ways to think about it. So here we are today, right, with a pretty with a situation where, for all the historical reasons we just mentioned, there's concentration of poverty and also of race in certain communities across our state, and the average wealth of a Black family is about $16,000. A Latino family across the country, $18,000, and then a white family, the average is over I think it's $150,000. So when you're trying to buy and sell homes, you're going to just find, not just because there's of the majority minority, sort of split in this state, but through buying power, it's going to be difficult to serve people of color, but also just, there's a lot of working class and low-income white people in Colorado as well. So it's going to be difficult to get them into home ownership compared to someone who comes in with more money. So, what can you do? And so just a couple of thoughts would just be, so outside of policy, when you come into a community and you're looking for, you're working with so if you already have a client and you're trying to find a buyer for their home, your job is probably to try to maximize but both for your own bottom line and for your client, the amount of money that they're going to get off that home by selling it. So, but another way to look at it would be to say, what kind of person do you want to buy your home? Is it would you like, a family or someone maybe locally who's a renter, to be able to purchase? What are the values of your seller to help, provide opportunities for other people who are coming in? If those values include some of the things that I just said, then there's two ways of looking at it. You can try to find a buyer for your client who, is going to, like, you'll set the price of the home here, and then, it'll eventually escalate, probably much higher, as we're all seeing. But you could also work with someone who's interested in your client's home and increase their buying power. Now, I know lots of you will probably already do that through connecting people with home buyer education and first-time home buyer programs. But if you really center that value with your client, then you can help ensure that as a neighborhood becomes, as a neighborhood starts to change, it doesn't just benefit new people coming in, but it benefits the people who are already there, right? Who are renters or are lower income by pairing those things together. So just some thoughts for how to do that. But so your question about other communities communities across the state in Western Colorado, et cetera, that are looking for funds right now. Essentially what's happening is they're seeing all of these, they're seeing higher income households come in, and they're also seeing a lot of LLCs and or second home buyers coming in and taking up the housing stock and converting them to rentals. Quick stat, just back to Denver in Westwood, or actually just the whole western side of Denver. There was a study done by Renee Martinez Stone of the West Denver Renaissance Collaborative or Cornerstone Collaborative, I'm sorry. And it showed that for families that were mostly Latino families that were in school 1 year, but then their kids weren't in school the next year, they followed up with them to see, well, if they were homeowners, who owns that home now in the community and where did they go? And it was hard to find out where they went, but 75% of all of the homes that were purchased by those families who were no longer in that school, which meant they had left, were purchased by LLCs. So you're seeing this really massive change of turnover. And so essentially, so that's just West Denver, but similar out west in these smaller towns, everyone is having their housing stock converted either to short-term rentals or second homes, and it's getting rid of the supply for renters, like long-term renters and homeowners. So the funds that they're looking for really are planning and strategic funds. It's two types of things. One is figuring out how to create a plan that where the city's policies can help preserve some of the housing and or that's there for the workforce. And then the other is, how do we create new affordable housing? How do we get funds for programs like Gregory's if there's a housing component? Because usually there's going to be a pretty big gap between like if you're trying to create an affordable home or affordable rental development and you're purchasing in today's market, there's going to be a big gap between what you need to earn over 30 years in order to pay off your mortgage and what your rent or selling is actually going to be able to pay for. So cities are looking for specific funds for specific sites that they have identified that they need to revitalize, but want to have a residential component. And they have a hard time attracting the type of capital that they need in order to do that. They don't have any affordable housing programs. They have no staff. They might not even have like a planning staff, and so identifying and finding the right partners to fund those sites is a huge need. And it's really interesting right now because we have an interesting opportunity where there's these ARPA funds, right? The new revitalization or recovery funds that came down through Biden's plan. And there's a couple $1 billion coming to Colorado and about 500 million that have been identified at the state level for housing, for affordable housing. And actually this month, there's a group that's convening at the state that's trying to figure out, okay, we have to spend $500 million on housing. How do we prioritize that? Where should those funds go? What programs should it go into? And so there's a stakeholder committee, I don't think it's been appointed yet, that's going to figure out how to spread those dollars across different communities. And so there's a lot of work to see what can we do with existing resources, and with all these new resources, how can communities tap into them? Just a quick example, Aurora, historically has had something like $2 to $4 million a year spent on affordable housing. The ARPA funds that received this year were $65 million because there's a state allocation, and then there's and then different sized municipalities get their smaller but still massive allocations. So just what in the communities that you're working in, if they're larger and maybe have their own ARPA allocation, it'd be interesting to plug in and see how they're planning on using a portion of it for affordable housing, and maybe talking through some of the best practices that Gregory and all of us have talked about how they can help them preserve and increase their workforce housing and or housing for families that are in the community, and not just let it all get swallowed up. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answered your question, but that is how I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, absolutely, it definitely does. Thank you so much. So, Jonathan, what I want to touch on a couple of pieces that you mentioned, and they're actually kudos that go back to the Colorado Association of Realtors. So you're absolutely correct. Those dollars that are flowing into the state of Colorado, we're aware of that. I believe today, if I'm not mistaken, that Tyrone Adams, our CEO, is actually having a meeting with a couple of our elected officials to have that specific discussion on those dollars as they pertain to housing affordability and housing attainability within the different areas of the state. So that's one huge kudos. If there's anyone that's on today that wants to get involved in the government affairs side of that or have involvement on that, I would highly and strongly recommend that you connect with Liz Peets. She will guide you in the right direction. The other piece of that, when you were talking about, steps that we can take in helping the consumer in getting into homes and what that looks like, actually, again, through the Colorado Association of Realtors, we have the opportunity to move forward 4 bills. And I think one of which you and your organization supported, that helps in documenting and recording rental income so that we can start to establish that rental history that we can utilize to help in not just the education piece, but helping in giving and providing resources and tools to the consumer so that they can, in fact, build the foundation that they need to step into home ownership. So the association is very proactive. We understand that there is an opportunity and a need for not only just down payment assistance, we understand that that's important, establishing credit history, education is key. So all things that we're actively and currently working on. So thank you to the association. And Jonathan, thank you for leading us directly to that. We can pay you later. So
well, I just want to, it's you guys are in a really interesting place. It's your whole industry. Real estate agents are often pretty maligned, I think, by sort of nonprofits and advocates. You're kind of seen as the reason why these communities are gentrifying. And it's like rich people coming to these neighborhoods. Who's at the front end, the harbinger of doom is everyone coming in and calling up the homes of people who might not want to sell but are under financial duress, and they're cash for your home now type things, or up and coming community. That kind of approach and that marketing is often sort of synonymized with your industry, and I think it's you play a very important role. Home ownership is 2 things. It's both a home for a roof over people's head, the most important aspect of building up their security. It's shelter, food, and water, right? I guess air as well. Mm-hmm. But then it's also an asset, and it's how people develop wealth. It's the number one. I think it's the most important contributor to wealth building of any asset that are in the typical family across the state. So there's that economic. It's almost like a stock in that way. So what is your role with a commodity that is traded, but also is essential to providing security and safety and well-being? There's treating your business as both as both things, and acknowledging both roles is a really important way moving forward. And I really appreciate the Realtors Association taking some of these policies and figuring out, well, okay, if we know that we're just providing a service, but there's a disproportionate effect on low-income people, how can we increase their buying power so that we serve more people? And Elizabeth Peets really, we really enjoyed working with her and with the association on that initiative to just increase to find ways to improve credit so that lower income people were more likely to be eligible for some of these homes. So everyone who's part of the association, part of a group that made a lot of really impactful changes this year, and continuing to sort of voice that this is the sort of thing that you want the association to work on, and here are other ideas, so that you can use all your power as a force for change to improve equity along with homeownership rates across different communities. The other policy you all worked on, I believe, was incentivizing communities to take up affordable, it was funds in exchange for adopting certain policies that increase affordable housing, through like density, et cetera, some of the things that Gregory was talking about. Anyway, I'll stop there, but at an individual level, at the association level, and at the policy level, there are ways that real estate agents can really plug into change, because if you just do the status quo, then the status quo will just continue.
We'll be here in 10 years having the same conversation, or a little bit different. Exactly. No, I appreciate it. Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you for the kudos as well. Just so you know, one of our mottos that we have here with the Realtors is that's who we are. And I couldn't agree with you more that we play such an important role in weaving together the fabrics of our community. And I think that that's evident with the people that are taking the time out of their day to show up today. It's something that's at the forefront of their business. They understand the importance that it has in their community, and the role that we play in that. So thank you, thank you. Before we move on, Annalise, you're not getting off the hook. I would love to hear from you.
Yeah.
So Denver is focusing more on investing with it, like in the communities, and you touched on this a little bit. Can you talk to us about that, and even tie in maybe a few best practices for us on the realtor side? And don't shy away from policy and advocacy, because as you see, we embrace it and we enjoy it.
Yeah, certainly. I will say, I think Gregory and Jonathan really hit on kind of all of my points of what your association and agents across the state and region can really be doing. So I would just be saying it in slightly different words. What I am going to maybe then instead just supplement and talk about, to just offer a different perspective, is acknowledging that the city and governments for a long time have also been in part to blame through creating policies and programs and restrictive zoning codes that did not take an equity-based lens. And what I mean by that is governments, and I think many continue to be motivated by economic drivers and growth and opportunity and tax revenue. And oftentimes that comes at the cost of our most vulnerable residents. And so the paradigm shift that I've certainly seen happen over the past 10 years and more recently in other communities and some communities across the state, I would say are just hitting the tip of the iceberg. But I think really what we have to first start by doing is rebuilding trust. I think so many of these communities, I think Global area Swansea is a prime example of where government at a local and federal level have continued to dismantle trust in the community, take advantage of it, continue to put industry in hazardous areas in people's communities, limit their opportunity to parks and access. And so as those investments are coming in and we are putting in new parks, many residents don't want it because they, one, fear that it's a sign of gentrification and they don't want the bike lanes, or they just feel like it's part of the government's scheme to sort of push them out. And I think that's a stark reality that we have to all acknowledge, is that we are coming into these communities from a place of privilege and understanding, and we have to first start in terms of building trust. So while that's my role as kind of a community planner, I also think that's really critical for realtors to be, thinking about, is how do I not just come in and say up and coming area, but how do I understand the area so I'm actually being true to my potential buyers and authentic to the community that is there. Let's celebrate the diversity. Let's celebrate the murals. Let's celebrate that there's tacos, stands on the corner. Like, Westwood's such an amazing neighborhood for that reason. There's so many aspects you can't find in other neighborhoods throughout the city. So I think, when we start building that trust and start working with the neighborhood to create shared visions of understandings to ensure that successful revitalization and growth and change, right? Denver's going to continue to grow. And we certainly have policies saying that we want to support equitable growth. we need to ensure that that growth is valuing the culture, the health of the communities, and really contributing to overall kind of positive human development, and ensuring that we're creating complete neighborhoods is another big kind of tenement of how we think about planning. But what looks like a complete neighborhood in Wash Park doesn't necessarily look like the same thing of a complete neighborhood in Westwood. And so that's where having those upfront community conversations to really ensure that while we might have a lot of academic understanding and professional technical expertise, that lived experience and day-to-day experience is invaluable. And that's where I think, planning and connecting with the community is part of my favorite. It's one of the favorite aspects of my job. And I think it's a really unique opportunity to really embrace that. And I think that, Gregory's point from that historic preservation, the stories of people, but kind of the living stories of these communities there today and really celebrating them. So that's, I think, just a little bit of how, we're starting to think differently in the community. And I think everyone needs to, when we're looking at places that are rapidly changing, just pausing and kind of getting to know and taking a different look at what adds value in communities. It might not be your typical checklist. I will also just note, if I've been looking at another screen, I now have probably about a 2-page email written up of a lot of resources, either kind of based on the chat or discussion, if people want additional links or literature or other things like that. So I'll share that with Natalie and Holly, and I'm sure they can disseminate that out appropriately. But there's just so much information on it, and I know we're kind of scratching the top of the surface, but there's also a lot of just fantastic innovation programs and strategies, some of which the city's working on. Others are ones like West Denver Renaissance Collaborative in partnership with Elevation Community Land Trust that's really focused on a stay in place program that offer where the community land trust comes in and purchases the land, maintains perpetual affordability, but the homeowner maintains the equity of the home. So it's sort of a shared wealth building opportunity. So there's a lot of new creative things. And I think back to, what can you guys do? Be open-minded to new programs and tools. Cooperative housing is another, thing that some might say is a trend, but I think that there's a lot of value in that. And there's different models of what that looks like, but expanding our idea of what the American dream is and supporting different housing types and educating yourself on. So when someone is saying, I want to purchase into a co-op housing situation, you can still help protect your buyer and ensure that they're making a wise financial decision, but you have an understanding of how that's different, say, than from a traditional, maybe conventional loan that they're going to be pursuing and those sorts of things. So I would say, as much as education of the homeowner is important, continuing education and, attending these sorts of webinars is just as critical, because housing needs are constantly changing, housing solutions are constantly changing. And so while it seems slow, there's a lot of cool, new, innovative things that I think we can continue to all learn and, share that understanding around.
Wonderful. Thank you, Annalise. I appreciate that. As you were sharing, there's something that just continues to pop up in the back of my mind. And realtors, we have this understanding of competency level when we're working in whatever field that we're working on. And I'd have to say, like, in terms of competency level, that's our opportunity. That's probably one of our bigger opportunities, especially after today's discussion. If I have a client that's interested in Pueblo, I probably would not be able to tell the story or paint the picture as well as Gregory was able to, but I know that there are counterparts that are in Pueblo that would be able to paint that picture. And as we talk about, our communities are going to continue to cycle. Our communities will continue to change. So what's important for us from the realtor standpoint, if we're looking at those best practices, to make sure that either you are competent enough to speak to it, to speak to the true nature of what's happening within a community, and actually listening to the communities that you're serving, to hear the stories so that you can pass that on to your clients. I think that there's so much value in that. Gregory, with what you're working on in sharing, or potentially, we're hoping, we're here to help you, let us know, potentially sharing with home buyers, if they are purchasing a historic home, what is that story? What does that look like? And what are they buying into? I think that creates a certain level of investment, not only for that individual, but in turn, the entire community, where they have an understanding that they are not just simply buying a home, they're playing a role in what that community is going to look like. And that we're welcoming to all, but here's where we were and here's where we are right now. And, we don't know where we're going to be in the future. So
And I
wanna-
would just say too, on that note too, I mean, it sounds like a cliche, but it is so true, is that realtors are like ambassadors for the community. They're the touch point. They're the first ones oftentimes that people will encounter, whether it's just they're looky-loos and they see a sign and they want to go and check out. They may not have an agent, they may have an agent, or they don't have a referral, they may have a referral. But at the end of the day, you know, that requires a very multifaceted and comprehensive knowledge of the community, because each, whether it's residential or commercial, each buyer is very, very different, but you have to have a very good understanding. And on the note of the American Rescue Plan, the ARPA, believe it or not, just before this call, I was on the call because Pueblo has $37 million that they're distributing, and we have 7 different pillars. So if there was ever a demographic, if there was ever a group of individuals, realtors could really be powerful. So at least in Pueblo, we are able to become a part of the task force. So I'm a part of 2 of the task force to vet and to go through these applications. And it's everything from housing to tourism to infrastructure to community resilience, where there's quite a different few categories. But at the end of the day, I would encourage any realtor who's either on this call or they get to see it in YouTube is to reach out to their local community, reach out to the mayor, reach out to your county commissioners, ask them, where is this money going? Because there are some communities where that money is not being distributed with the mindset and the thoughtfulness of the citizens. It's actually being done at a higher level. So I would just encourage anyone to get on the phone and say, where's my ARPA money going? And how can I be a part of deciding that? Realtors could be a huge, you know, part of that distribution process. I can't think of a better, you know, group that has to be engaged in all aspects of a local community.
I love it. Wonderful, Gregory. I'm glad that you did the call to action and I didn't have to. I have to echo what Gregory says. You're absolutely correct. Like I said, realtors don't sit on the sidelines. Call the CAR office, call your local association. If you're not sure, call Liz, she'll guide you in the right directions. I saw a couple of questions that came through in terms of particular bills and where we stand and where they are. Those are great questions, and they don't have to wait until we're on a workshop or a Zoom discussion together. Pick up the phone, shoot us an email. We are happy to discuss all of that with our members, because we do play a vital role. There are 1.5 million of us now. So, I mean, you're walking down the street, you're happy. I mean, the odds are you'll probably bump into a realtor. Make sure that we're one that you can pose the questions to, and that the consumer is happy with the answer that we provide. We are down to our last 5 minutes. Holly, I am going to open it up. I would say that we are probably able to take one question. So if you have a question that has not been answered, I will open it up to you to pose that question to our panelists.
I do. So the question is, they're wondering, there's been a lot of rumors about first-time home buyers, as we know, being bid out of the market, and the rumor is that it's corporate entities that are investing in properties. And they're wondering, would this be considered a significant contributing factor to current gentrification rates? And I think this is posed more towards Jonathan, because it was when he was talking.
There you go, Jonathan. Would you like
maybe we
to?
can get a second question. And I think actually someone in the chat did answer it. The answer is yes. That is a big part of it. I think the answer is just straight up yes. It's not the only factor. There's a lot of individuals who aren't LLCs or corporate entities that are coming in and buying. I mentioned a lot of the second home buyers, et cetera. That is a large part of it. Actually, the rate of growth among single-family homes. So if you look at contribution to the growth in rental properties across the state, the growth of multifamily properties, creating new units since 2010 that are rental units is slightly slower in Colorado than the rate of single-family homes contribution to the increase in rental properties. Not all that is corporate entities, but that's a big part of it. So as single family homes get converted to rentals, corporate entities have a big part of it. But maybe we can get another question if there's time.
Great answer, Jonathan. Thank you. I appreciate that. And just to speak to that, I believe NAR had an article on this specific topic. It might have come out in the Realtor magazine or one of the articles that were shared. I want to say it was about a week or 2 weeks ago. So we can try to find that news source and include that in the resources that go out. Okay. Holly, let's see. I feel like we are a race against the clock. Do you have another question for us?
Well, I don't know if you guys want to, I do. So this one was the final question. I think this was aimed at on Elise was how can the NEST program be regulated?
Oh, Annalise.
Yeah, so NEST is a department, and I apologize if I didn't make that clear. So just like I work for community planning and development, NEST is a division within the Denver Office of Economic Opportunities, kind of our economic development office. And so a variety of these tools, you know, when I saw that one come in, I wasn't quite paying attention when I was talking, so I wasn't sure which specific program, but maybe it was the preference policy or something. But just take a wing at it. But the preference policy was one that I was speaking to, where existing residents have an opportunity to kind of have a greater preference in being able to move into those affordable homes that are available, either new construction or maybe an acquisition type project. And San Francisco and other communities have a program around it, but essentially they use an online kind of web-based system that pools all affordable housing in the city. But because it's then taking where people currently live, how long they've lived there and reside, then when those new housing pieces come on the market, it almost acts like an easy dating app, if you will, for someone looking to lease up their building, where it's going to say, okay, 10% of your units are subject to the preference policy. The rest just are subject to income restriction. Here's your first 10 residents that live in the existing area. So there's certainly an infrastructure that is needed on the back end from a city kind of tracking and monitoring perspective. We know that monitoring affordable housing income restricted units does take a lot of resources, and many times that's not an opportunity for some smaller or more rural programs. And so, you know, while there are typically covenant restrictions associated to income restricted units, ensuring that those covenants are not being lost during the sale of title and that it's not being sold to someone who doesn't meet those income eligibility, that's an important piece that communities think about, the needed infrastructure to effectively implement those programs and policies, but maintain and ensure their compliance over time. And also track and measure our success. I think that's something that the need for government accountability is really important and something that we're critically thinking about. So ensuring that we're also not just putting dollars and resources into programs that aren't meeting the needs of the residents or producing the outcomes that we want. So when we look at any sort of new policy, we think of, one, is this the right policy? Can help? And that's, you know, working with the community, best practices from other communities, our own research. How can we ensure effective implementation, and how can we track and monitor it and report out? So those are the things that we're kind of thinking about from the city's perspective when we deploy new resources into communities.
Beautiful. Thank you, Annalise. I appreciate that. And what makes me really excited is the accountability piece. I think that's something that came up as we were looking at the Century of Opportunities bill, the package that went through this year. That accountability piece is important, right? We want to see what's happening. You know, is it successful? Are there opportunities for us to tweak? In other situations, it's where are the dollars going and are they being allocated appropriately? So fabulous. Thank you. Thank you. Joanne, I saw in the chat the question of other topics or the continuation of this discussion. I'm so glad that you posted that. We would love to hear from our membership. So from the realtors across the state, if there are topics, if you want to continue and dive deeper into the gentrification topic, send Holly an email, and Holly, I'm apologizing, send Holly an email with those topics. The Diversity and Inclusion Committee is committed to providing continuing education, or education, not continuing ed, but education in terms of fair housing and diversity, inclusion, and equity for our industry to help better serve the communities that we live, work, and play in. So if there are topics that have popped up out of today's discussion, we'd love to hear all about them. while we're on the, oh, fabulous, Holly, thank you for jotting your email address. I do want to give you a heads up on an opportunity that we have coming up so that you can learn more. In the, oh gosh, let me get the right month. I believe October, if I'm not mistaken, CAR is going to have our fall forum, and we actually have 2 panel discussions where we are going to continue diversity and inclusion topics. But I also want to plant the seed for those of you that hung around the entire time. We are going to have the opportunity to award 4 awards at the Fall Forum inaugural event, and we are recognizing businesses, organizations, individuals, and brokerages and/or associations that have a diversity and inclusion initiative. Check out our website, the Colorado Realtors website, so that you can find the qualifications and requirements to be a recipient or of that award, or a potential winner for the awards. We'll have 4 awards, but we would love to start to see those nominations come in because we know that there are so many realtors, organizations, and brokerages within the state that are taking the step. They're leading the charge when it comes to fair housing, diversity, inclusion, and equity within our industry. So keep an eye out for that. Last but not least, panelists. Thank you. I cannot thank you enough. Today's discussion, it definitely opened my eyes, looking at gentrification from a different standpoint, looking at the transformation and cycle of our communities that we serve. I definitely am looking at that differently now. The conversations that I'll have with my clients will also adjust after our time together today. So thank you, thank you. I appreciate you guys so much. I think I've touched on all of our housekeeping pieces. With that, I'd like to wish you guys an amazing day. Thank you for joining us. Holly, I'm all done. Thanks, you guys. Have a good day.